Excellent. And so in week 6, you move on to gender. And this is kind of interesting for me to see because I actually had no idea that Illich ever really wrote about gender. I'm certainly no Illich scholar myself. And so he has said some interesting things. I would love to unpack this a little bit. So one quote here is that he says, "As the ascetic and the poet meditate on death and thus gratefully enjoy the exquisite aliveness of the present, so we must face the sad loss of gender. I strongly suspect that a contemporary art of living can be recovered so long as our austere and clear-sighted acceptance of the double ghetto of economic neuters then moves us to renounce the comforts of economic sex." What is he referring to when he says the sad loss of gender, and what does he mean by economic sex?
Yeah, so I mean, this was a very controversial book. It got very slammed by a lot of feminists at the time, and kind of contributed to it's a big downturn, I would say, in Illich's reception. But I think there's a lot here to kind of resurrect, and so his argument really about gender prior to what he calls the neuter, like the kind of economic neuter, is to say that there was segregation in terms of sex and in terms of the roles that men and women had in society, and that this was in a way not necessarily good or bad. And I think this is one of the problems that anybody has about talking about sexual difference today, is that there's an automatic assumption that if you even invoke sexual difference, then you must be saying that one sex is better than the other, or that, you know, that if we go back to thinking about pre-modern types of sexual roles, that somehow we must be celebrating reactionary or traditionalist understandings of men and women, and that, you know, if you're a man or a woman, you should be doing certain kinds of things. And I don't think Illich is doing that. You know, he kind of starts by asking, like, why are women why have women historically been kind of economically inferior to men? And tries to sort of be incredibly sympathetic. Like, in a way, this is his response to a lot of the feminist movement, you know, and this is in 1982, this book comes out. And so he's trying to kind of respond to a lot of the feminist points about unpaid labour, so shadow work or housework, you know, the increasing politicisation of things like childcare and so on in advanced industrial societies, we would say, which happens at the late 60s, mostly in the 70s in Western countries. You know, there becomes a kind of, you know, obviously political discussion about that, and we have the rise of second wave feminism, broadly speaking, around this time. So it's his response to this, and the way he tries to do it is to trace back this idea of gender, and whether he's using the right word there or a word we would accept, because obviously gender came to mean several different things in the decades after he's using it. But we could say, loosely speaking, that what he means is perhaps what we might call sexual difference today in certain ways, which is to say that there is a difference between men and women, and that this plays out socially, or at least did in a kind of pre-modern period. Because it's definitely the case, if we think about capitalism and we think about employment under capitalism, that people are more or less treated, particularly in advanced technological language-based knowledge economies, as more or less interchangeable. Like, it doesn't particularly matter if you're a man or a woman, if you're doing a data entry job. It doesn't matter to your employer. It might matter in certain contexts, but it doesn't in general. Like, there is a kind of neutering of sex in the workplace, which is to say you are simply an employee, right? And you work and you sell your labour power and so on. And so men and women, in a way, have become much more similar in certain ways. Certainly as liberal subjects, we would also say that there's a kind of indetermination in many respects, whether it's to do with dating or consumption or whatever. You know, that the difference between men and women has been largely eradicated, socially speaking.
I see. So when he talks about economic sex, he's referring to this kind of reduction of sex to this kind of industrial capitalist interchangeability.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could put it like this. I mean, it's one of his kind of most well-researched books, actually. It's one of his longest books, and it's kind of interesting that it got kind of ignored and also slammed very much so. Like, he was accused of being kind of completely reactionary by a lot of feminists.
Nowadays this would be anathema, right? I mean, so basically what he's saying is that we need to reaffirm gender differences, biological sex differences, and in the reaffirmation and reclarification of that, we will find enhanced kind of humanistic, experiences with each other.
I think more weakly put, though, we could say simply that to understand the history of sex in relation to economics is an unfinished project, and that this is a contribution to that debate, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is an interesting idea, and it does make some sense because, a lot of people today think that if you just liberalize sexual and gender norms, that somehow this is good for this is humanistic, that this is nicer to people with differences. Makes everyone feel equal. This makes everyone feel, comfortable and at home. But in fact, what we're watching right now is that when you liberalize sexual and gender norms, and pretty much anyone can claim to be any gender, and there's no reason to be in a committed relationship. Just be poly, be gender, be like whatever you want is all equally good. This kind of ideology, it actually makes people pretty unhappy and extremely conflictual, and so it seems to never really bring the satisfaction and the peace and the equality and all these kind of humanistic longings that we have. It seems to never really bring them. So I think people are very open to this argument nowadays that or at this moment, I think Illich's logic here could be quite compelling.
No, I don't disagree. And I think, again, as part of the post-liberal discussion, there is an attempt to rethink the question of family, the centrality of, personal and private relations as a kind of foundation and central social bond that has been eradicated or eroded, let's say, at least. The difficulty, actually, the economic difficulty of people who want to start a family, it's become very, very hard if you don't have much money, if you're working all the time. If you want to start a family, it's increasingly difficult, right? And, there are lots of kind of, and the sort of liberal ideology that says that work, getting a job or career is more important than having a family, I think is being questioned on a massive scale. I mean, there's always a lot of people for whom that's never the case. But I think for the PMC or the middle class, that kind of promise of emancipation through selling your labour power is sort of dying an even more obvious death. And I think the atomization of contemporary life is, it's clear that a kind of loving, committed family relation, marriage and children, there was maybe a reason why that was traditional. Like maybe human beings thought that this was, a good way of organizing things like sexual desire and love and affection and support. So I think there is, we need to revisit these questions.
Yeah, it's interesting also to think back to what you said about graceful playfulness. That was such a lovely phrase, because it's easy to see how that connects to this as well, because in what Illich calls the loss of gender, men and women are kind of robbed of their traditional ancestral modes of graceful playfulness in a way. Like there is a particular tradition, a cultivated, long-running reservoir of ideas and attitudes and behaviors that are gendered and that do give us as humans this repository of scripts in a way to engage in a kind of a serious graceful playfulness. And this just makes a lot of sense, actually, now that I think about it, because when everyone is supposed to be potentially any gender, it kind of robs men and women of their gendered ways of engaging in graceful playfulness. What sometimes might be called like flirting, or what not necessarily even flirting, but when all of this stuff is just kind of like flattened, it actually makes it harder to move through the world in a way that is light and fun and sexy, like in these kind of low level subtle ways that actually give life its pizzazz. A lot of like, I guess what I'm basically suggesting is that in the loss of gender, there's way more kind of lifestyle content, lifestyle kind of potential and freedom and joy. A lot more is being erased than is obviously sexual. It's not clearly gendered or sexual, but it's being erased simply because a lot of that traditional reservoir of actions and attitudes and behaviors are essentially gendered. So if you flatten gender, then you also flatten out these various little micro ways in which men and women historically have expressed themselves and engaged in this kind of playfulness. So that's really interesting to me. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think it's exactly right. So all these rituals of not only of courtship, but of manners and etiquette and so on, which are kind of predicated on an assumption of gender in Illich's sense. No, I completely agree. And what we then have, and Illich was always talking against safety in a certain way, right? Like this obsession with risk and controlling everything is the part of the bureaucratization, the technocracy, policing of everyday life, right? So that when you start to have societies that have very strict rules, but they're top down, they're not rules from the people or rituals, they are like, legislation they're bringing in about, for example, if men wolf whistle at a woman, then they should be arrested. And we could say, like, okay, maybe it's unpleasant to be wolf whistled at, but to have at the moment we're not allowed to hug each other in this country. Like, so the Prime Minister gave a little talk about hugging. I mean, it's this kind of absolutely deranged sort of technocratic control over people's bodily encounter, which is always sexed. It's always sexuated. And so in that sense, I think gender, this, very unpopular book by Illich and very unknown book by Illich, might well be very helpful for rethinking what's happening.
Yeah, totally. I'm very interested in this because this is also one of the reasons why the contemporary workplace is so dreadful, is because it's like, I'm not even talking about men flirting with women or anything like that. Not even saying that at all. Like, I'm happily married, and in the workplace, I would never flirt with a woman. But it's like, you, as a man, you don't even want to be charming, slightly. You know what I mean? Because it could be interpreted as flirting or something like that. And so it's like, it causes the workplace to be particularly dreadful because no one wants to be charming to other people. And so it just, how dreadful is that, right?
Absolutely. And, you've got the massive expansion. This is an institution that in Illich's sense of human resources, and they, what are they going to do if they're not going to be able to respond to complaints about every micro perceived aggression or, form of sexual harassment or whatever. And, lots of people used to meet their spouses at work, right? This used to be a place where you would encounter somebody else and you'd get together. But, I think that randomness has been replaced by the kind of total regimentation of dating and meeting, right? So if you want to meet someone, you have to use an app, and I write about this in the Man book, this, the proposals to kind of blockchain consent and to have all encounters registered. This is terribly frightening world in which there's never any risk. You don't just randomly meet someone in a bar or at work. Everything has to be regulated. But what that means for those places, those institutions, is then the person or the sentiment who is most afraid will come to ultimately dominate the entire culture of that institution, right? So if somebody is the person who's most neurotic or anxious about any form of social interaction, their sentiment or their anxiety will start to be the feeling of the institution as a whole, right? Because even other people who are being playful will be perceived to be breaking these rules.
Totally. And this is why shows like Mad Men were so popular. It's because it's like anything that shows people what life might have sort of been like back in the day when men and women in the workplace actually could be sexy, it's I think just irresistibly attractive. It's just like, I want to be, when I go out into the world, I want to be moving around in spaces where everyone is encouraged to be their most, interesting, charming, and I don't want to say sexy or attractive, but charming, I think, is maybe just the best word that gets at that kind of non-sexual quality that kind of is on a vector towards sexuality or towards sexual attractiveness, but not quite. I really do think the loss in just the quality of life is way larger than people realize, simply just because of how much it creates this stranglehold on all forms of kind of creative, flamboyant charmingness. and
or
it's
playfulness.
just crazy to think. Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's like, if you run the risk of getting seriously penalized or formally reprimanded or losing your job for making a kind of gentle, playful comment, which is misinterpreted, then nobody is going to make a gentle, playful comment anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
That's reality.
Right. So